I think there are going to be more people that are going to be joining us, but I just wanted to go ahead and get started. We've got a lot to cover tonight. We're really excited that you've all joined us. Welcome. I'm Carolyn Eberly, founding director of Indivisible Charlotte. So excited that you are joining us here tonight for our Indivisible Charlotte in the Know Live, our program National INSecurity. We are thrilled to have advocate and attorney Mark Zaid with us tonight. But before we jump into the specifics about tonight's program, for those of you who are not familiar with Indivisible Charlotte, welcome. We've been around for about 8.5 years with the goal of educating and engaging our community in civic and electoral activism in our community, with the ultimate goal of strengthening democracy. We've got a lot of work ahead of us. So if you want to learn more about us or join our group or find out what other events we're having, please visit our website. We're going to drop that into the chat for you. But so why are we here tonight? We're hoping that tonight's program will help educate and inform members on current issues and challenges related to national security, rule of law, due process, and freedom of speech in this moment. So the way this is going to work, Marshall Aron, our Indivisible member, is going to be introducing our guest, and we'll be asking him some of the most pertinent questions for about the first 30 minutes. We're going to take participant questions through the chat. So if you would like to pose a question, please put a Q before your question in the chat, and we will take that and put it into a list of questions. And then Marshall will ask those questions, and we'll try to wrap it up right around 8 o'clock. So with no further ado, I would like to turn it over to Marshall to introduce our guest.
Thanks, Carolyn. We're very pleased tonight to have Mark Zaid with us. He's an attorney based in DC who specializes in crisis management and administrative and litigation matters, primarily relating to national security, international law, foreign, sovereign, and diplomatic immunity, and the Freedom of Information Privacy Acts. Mr. Zaid often represents former, current federal employees, particularly intelligence and military officers, defense contractors, whistleblowers, and others who have grievances, who have been wronged or are being investigated by agencies of the U.S. or foreign governments. Most notably, he served as a lawyer for the intelligence official who exposed the Ukraine scandal, which led to President Trump's first impeachment. He's now battling the revocation of his own security clearance by the administration. Our guest has been repeatedly named for various honors, such as the Washington, D.C. super lawyer and one of DC's most influential people for national security and legal intelligentsia. Mr. Zaid co-founded Whistleblower Aid, which provides pro bono legal representation to whistleblowers, and has testified before various government bodies, including various House and Senate committees. Attorney Zaid, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Marshall. Thank you, Carolyn, and Indivisible. And I wish I was down in Charlotte. So as we were talking before we went live, there's a fantastic comic book convention at the convention center for those. So for those who are local, go check out the comic book convention.
I wish we had time to talk about comics, and but we'll have to save that for another time. Just to start off, I wanted to just ask you a question about political violence. We're seeing an increase in the level of political violence in the U.S. And as you know, in the last week, we saw the assassination of a Minnesota state representative, the shooting of a Minnesota state senator, and the forceful treatment by the FBI agents of a U.S. senator in California. And just first off, I mean, what's your level of concern about political violence and the failure of the president to speak out against it?
Well, depending on how old we are, the level of political violence, maybe we have a different view on it. Right. I was born in the turbulent 60s during Vietnam. Don't remember it, only know it obviously from more of history. For those who lived in, especially again, the South in the 50s, depending on obviously what color your skin might have been, could be a very different and difficult situation. But if we look to it, let's say in the last, say, 40, 50 years, absent the war efforts of folks protesting, of Republicans and Democrats or independents like myself, of where we are with respect to political violence, I think we have seen nothing like this than what we are experiencing today. And I'll give you a specific example. So I've been practicing law now for over 3 decades. I've always been here in Washington, D.C. I proceed towards accountability. I don't care about politics. I represent Republicans. I represent Democrats. I represent the little guy. I represent the most senior officials in the US government at times. I challenge whoever is in power. It doesn't make a difference. It's about accountability. There will be times, or have been in the past, where I'll get some nasty letter in the mail, or when email started an email or a voicemail, whatever it might be. It wasn't until really the last 10, 15 years, and quite frankly, most particularly the first Trump administration to where we are now, where the divisiveness and the hatred of the extremes of both sides have just increased significantly. Now, I will take topics that the left doesn't like also at times, and I will receive negative comments from the left also, but they are usually more just sort of calling names, or maybe some bad language. They have like never been threatening. I've received multiple death threats from those on the far right, those MAGA, so much so that the FBI investigated a number of them, and one gentleman was prosecuted back in by the Trump administration, the first one, for threatening my life, and served over a year in jail. Just never saw that before. And anyone who just goes on X and just says something that the other side doesn't like, whichever side it might be, you will experience it yourself. So I think it is a real dangerous time. And obviously with the I can't even say the word, the ability to get weapons very easily, let's put it that way, when I can't say the word properly, it obviously throws things into a different situation. I'll finish with the one thing. The thing that scared me the most and why I take different steps now was what was called Pizzagate, where a lone gunman came up actually from the Carolinas to Washington, D.C., to a place called Comet Pizza, just an Italian restaurant pizza joint, because online everyone was saying that Hillary Clinton was handling a child pedophile trafficking ring in the basement of this restaurant. And the guy drove up, lone gunman, no planning with anybody else, drove up from the Carolinas to DC with weapons in his car, had an AR-15, entered the establishment, shot it up. Thank God no one was injured. And by the way, there's no basement in this restaurant. So, what a shock. Everything that was online was false about it, but there was no way to predict that guy was going to come up and do that. That scares me. That was a political attempt at assassination, much like what we saw, sadly, in Michigan last week.
So Mark, just to take this a little further, some analysts have said that when the political system grinds to a halt, when you really don't have an effective opposition, or Congress working together, for example, that it really leads to political violence. And do you think this is evidence of a further breakdown of our government process and the rule of law?
So some of it I will blame on the internet. And I'll explain why. Back in the early mid-90s, I did a lot of work against Holocaust denialism, and going after neo-Nazis. And I also dealt a lot with the Kennedy assassination research-wise. Now, back at that time, I started to see an overlap between the two for recruitment purposes by the Holocaust denialists, anti-Semitic people. Militia groups were part of all this. But they were very disorganized because they were only organized locally, right? They can only reach the people who were in essentially arm's grasp that they could go and have meetings with, because they'd have to write letters. Remember those, right? You got to put a stamp on it. You got to wait till the post office delivers it. Okay, you can make phone calls, but remember how much it cost to make phone calls, and especially in state at times. It wasn't cheap. Technology then enhanced the ability to have, you can make as many phone calls now as you want. You can call for free on WhatsApp, on Signal around the world, and you have email. So like-minded people, in good ways for perhaps taking down a dictator in some country, are using email and internet capability to talk, but also the haters are able to do so now as well. So this has spurred them on so much and given them the ability to coordinate with one another and only hear from one another. And that's on both sides, left and right. You know, people will only now watch what they want to watch and only get news from one side, get a bias, whatever, whether good or bad. And the violence in particular, what I saw on the right, oftentimes, like these people were never coming to actually physically harm me, but they would be drinking, they would be emboldened online, they think there's no consequences, and they'll just send these threatening messages. But if you post something, let's say, you know, you're advocating for whatever your position is, you want to help build an animal shelter in your town, and you start posting online, and all of a sudden you start getting attacked, you know, violently by people, you know, verbally, in writing, you know, that has an impact on people, and that tends to push people away, because who wants to be subject to that? So you withdraw, and instead of promoting something that would be positive for the community, because very likely you got attacked by someone who doesn't even live in your community, they just wanted to do that, if it was even a human being, because we could have a separate lecture on how many bots and foreign governments are using this as a way to create disruption in the United States. That's a really interesting topic that hopefully somebody can do a deep dive on. How much of the divisiveness is actually homegrown versus seeded from overseas? Because we know the Russians were engaged in doing that. I mean, that's been done historically around the world in trying to feed or foment hatred in a particular location to create the type of chaos, frankly, that we're seeing now.
Yeah, that's a great point. We something we really need to talk about some more. Hey, let's talk a little bit more about Trump administration policy. One analyst recently said that the Trump administration has no friends or enemies, just business interests. What are your thoughts on this and the apparent commingling of Trump's business interests with domestic and foreign policy?
In fact, the first lawsuit I filed against Donald Trump was back in March of 2017, and it was with respect to his ownership of the Trump Hotel, which was just opening in Washington, D.C., that he had bought the old post office, which was a great tourist attraction. And here it was, he's having this hotel that foreign dignitaries would stay at, Americans would stay at, anyone who wanted to gain favor would go have their either stay or party at the Trump Hotel and then tell Trump about it, or his staff right at the White House a block or two away on Pennsylvania Avenue. And it was a great way that really commingled, you know, the ethics of using the office for purposes of financial gain. We lost the case. It was on technical grounds of trying to figure out this DC law as to whether or not it would play a role, but that was a legal issue. That was rule of law. You know, look, rule of law is winning and losing. It's going through the process. It doesn't change the ethical situation. And what we see with the Trump administration, of course, and those around it or in it, the families, as well as the officials, is the amount of money that is being made and the ethical lines that have been crossed, either because they've just been crossed completely, or the norms that held and bound that together as far as what most people would think was inappropriate to do has fallen by the wayside. So we've seen lots of close Trump associates in the government make millions off of what looks to be insider trading, at least superficially or facially. We've seen lots of issues. Obviously, the Trump org just announced this new cellular company that's going to be making tons of money. Trump Social, of course, as well as trademarks that the family has received, businesses that they're developing overseas. You know, I mean, it reminds, for the older folks, I do remember Jimmy Carter and his brother. I remember Billy Carter. I remember Billy Beer. I remember Billy's dealing with Libya in the mid-70s when I was a kid. It was that significant in the news that I, as like a 7, 8-year-old, 9-year-old, knew what was going on, because we hadn't seen anything like that. And I'll throw out a term, we can talk about it further, or at least people can research it. This notion of what this is patrimonialism. And patrimonialism can be a form of authoritarianism, which we can talk about. But what it means is they're not engaged in the government for purposes of power. Power is part of it, but it's a personal interest. It's a profit-making device, as what you're describing in your question. The ability to use the power you have in the position and those around you to gain personal financial benefits. And if this administration is doing anything, clearly that is up there at the top.
I want to go into authoritarianism, but before we leave this, I just wonder if this approach to policy priorities could affect Trump's decision making on dealing with the current current foreign policy crisis in Iran.
Well, I mean, that clearly has been the concern, whether it's with Iran or any other country. The notion of why haven't we been as hard on China? Well, Trump has a lot of financial interests in China. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why, as a country, we can't be hard on China. They own most of our debt. It causes a problem to be hard on them. But I mean, I suppose, thankfully, we don't do a lot of business with Iran since obviously 1979 and Khomeini taking power there. There is a lot of back and forth of people in the Washington, D.C. area where I am. There's a huge Iranian population still coming back and forth, but not from a business standpoint because of sanctions and the like. But let's look at Gaza without getting into the messiness, obviously, of that whole situation. Was he being serious or not that he was going to turn Gaza and the beach, which is beautiful, into a luxurious condominiums and hotels of which he would play a role? Does it take a lot of stretch of imagination that actually, as he was saying that, there were some light bulbs going off on the top of his head going, maybe we could do that. That could be a business venture there.
Let's shift to authoritarianism. Let's dig into that a little more deeply. I'm just wondering, what's your perspective on how far down the path to authoritarianism we are in the U.S.? And as you said, this concept of patrimonialism, perhaps that's just a different version of it or a different shade of it. And considering how far down the path we are, how difficult or challenging will it be to reverse this?
Yeah, they're great questions. So the notion of authoritarianism, right, to us as Americans, and until the last few years, we would never think about that is something that could ever take root in the United States. That's something that happens other countries, third world countries for the most part, or, the great enemy of the Soviet Union / Russia. Though for most people, most Americans today, Russia has not been much of a threat since Soviet Union dissolved. It's only really been in the last few years. But if you look from like the early 90s when it dissolved in 91 to, let's say, when Putin took power 10, 15 years later, very different situation than what we grew up in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s with the Soviet Union, Ronald Reagan, etc. So authoritarianism, it throws a lot of people off and creates a lot of distaste in people's mouth, because what we will usually throw out as an example is going to be Hitler and the Nazis, Stalin in the Soviet Union, the purge of millions of people, the murder of millions of people. Well, authoritarianism, of course, does not have to be murderous. There are other forms of it. It's about the notion of the control and the power. And what we have seen in the Trump administration and the kind of theory and government control he's done is authoritarian in nature. The ridiculing of the opposing party, the attacks on everyone else, the purge of individuals who would be in oversight authorities, including ones he appointed in his first administration. The Office of Special Counsel, the Office of Government Ethics, the Inspector General's offices, the administrative judges in the Merit System Protection Board, the National Labor Relations Board, the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, all of these oversight authorities where he's been firing people, including, as I said, those he appointed in the first term, because they're not loyalists. They were conservatives. They were proposed by, say, the Heritage Foundation, others, senators, members of Congress who were Republicans who would advocate for these people. And these were just career people or, political people, but people who we would see come in and out of government on both sides, Republican, Democrat. If you look back to the history of Nazi Germany or National Socialism, the beginning years of it are very similar to what we are seeing here in the United States. This is before people were being murdered. This is the creation of power. This is going after the enemies and things like that, of passage of laws, of stripping away rights of certain categories of people. Now, right now, we're seeing it more illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants, however one wants to call them. We're seeing a reversal of social policies, which have been a step backwards of decades of growth here in the United States. It doesn't mean we're going to concentration camps. It doesn't mean we're going to that I am expecting, the SWAT teams to break down my door and drag me to prison. And that's where the patrimonialism comes into play, because this term, which was coined 100 plus years ago by Max Weber and others, it was a German political theorist. The notion is the opposite of Nazism, where in Nazism we had the Stasi. They had, power in the secret police. The people were scared of the secret police. The secret police would come into your homes, drag you away. That is not what's happening here in the United States. It's the opposite. It's the chaos. It's firing, thousands and thousands of workers. We lost 4,000 people at the Department of Justice, was reported the other day, since Trump came into office. If you think you're going to get your tax refund done anytime soon, that it's paid by the IRS, think again, because tons of people have left. If you want to submit a Freedom of Information Act request, you're not going to get it responded to because there's no one left in the office. That chaos actually creates greater power. The patrimonialistic individual like a Trump thrives on that because power still remains at the top, but there's no one beneath him or around him who can challenge him other than right now the courts, which we are seeing hold steadfast and the rule of law upheld. I'm trying to think the last number, almost 200, 170 something specific lawsuits against the administration for what he's been doing and terminating people, breaking down, destroying USAID as an agency or FEMA. And most of these challenges have been successful so far because rule of law has been upheld. And that's by judges he appointed in his first administration. The question is, how far down are we going to slip further? And if you look at the notion of constitutional crisis, which some people have thrown out, to me, that crisis will occur. It started. We can see it on the horizon, but we're not there. When the administration, as the executive branch, refuses to accede to or listen to or follow judicial rulings, we've seen a handful of them, but they can make excuses as to why they didn't do it. And either the case went up on appeal, something got stayed, or even they prevailed in the executive branch. If we get to a case at the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court rules against the Trump administration and they refuse to abide by that ruling, similar in a way that Andrew Jackson did in 1832, which was actually the state of Georgia that did it, but Jackson was involved with killing with the Native Americans, and the statement was, because nobody knows if this was true, Supreme Court ruled against Georgia, supported by the administration, and the statement was, well, the Supreme Court, they in what army are going to enforce their ruling? That to me will be the true, in in the American sense, constitutional crisis. We've already seen the legislative branch just, go silent. So they're not even in the fight any longer.
So in terms of, let's just paint a scene of, a year and a half from now, we may have interim elections, and 3.5 years from now, we may have a presidential election. If the opposition wins or gets a majority, do you think this is reversible, or do you think we're going down a path that's not reversible?
So I think we are not even close to the bottom. I think there's going to be a lot of pain in this country over the next few years. I think the difference will be when those who supported Donald Trump start to personally feel the pain. We're starting to see it. You can look in your newspapers or online every day where someone who voted for Trump, their spouse got deported or their business got raided because they employ undocumented aliens. And they never expected that they would be the ones who would suffer. Most of what's happening so far really hasn't impacted the majority of Americans. If you are someone who loves democracy, and that's a tough thing to say because I don't want to say that those on the other side don't love democracy, but if you loved and respected the system that existed prior to Trump, where there's give and take and there's not this type of patrimonialistic power, then you feel what's going on. If you uphold the rule of law and you see a refusal to abide by a ruling, you feel that pain. But if you don't care, if you're not involved with it, you just don't pay attention. You're sitting in the middle of whereversville, United States. You don't have anyone, family member in the military. You don't have a stock portfolio. You're comfortable in your local business. You don't employ anyone who's being deported and you don't know anyone it is. You don't feel it. So we need for those people, unfortunately, to feel it. And I do think we will grow stronger as a country. And again, to take a horrific example of, look how strong Nazi Germany is and how far they've advanced since the Nazis. Look how strong Japan is, how much they've advanced. I don't think most Americans realize how ruthless and brutal the Japanese were in the teens, 20s, and 30s. On some levels, worse than the Nazis at times. Who thinks of the Japanese as anything but like benevolent people, fighting back against Godzilla and others? They barely have an army at times. So I do think good can come out of bad. We burn a forest down to stop a forest fire. You cull deer when they get overpopulated. It's to save them, not to destroy them. But my sad part of that is I don't think we're even close to the pain.
Well, that's a pretty grim outlook if we have to take that sort of decline that either Japan or Germany felt in the late 19 or the mid.
The problem is,
1940s.
what would be the incentive otherwise for people to change? And I don't want us to go down the route that we're discussing, but I don't see how we change. Is someone just going to have an epiphany and realize, I probably shouldn't have acted that way? I don't think that's going to happen.
Let's let me do one more question before we go over to the audience. And I just wanted to talk a little bit more about due process and about the Department of Justice. And I wonder if you could give us your thoughts on how the Trump administration is undermining the independence of the Department of Justice from the executive, and the extent to which you think the Department of Justice and the FBI is weaponized and aimed at investigating and prosecuting opponents. You talked about how there's been a decrease in staff there, and I'm kind of wondering what your thoughts are on that and what some of the implications are.
So I represent a lot of FBI personnel as well as Justice Department personnel. Certainly work with them all the time because I sue these agencies all the time. But on a professional level, you become friends with your adversaries especially because they would go in and out of government. It didn't make a difference, Republican or Democrat. Most of them frankly, weren't partisan. They may have been registered in one way or the other and voted one way or the other, but they were career public servants. We have I think, I wouldn't say necessarily the first time, but at the height of it, um, obviously Donald Trump put in his personal lawyers into senior positions within the administration. He put in people who were very diehard loyal to him. Now, that's not to say that the attorney general is not a political position. People put in people who are close to them, who are known to them, but we've never before seen the Justice Department weaponized against perceived political enemies like we have in this administration. We haven't seen, certainly didn't have someone who denied that the 2020 election was fair, thinking that it was a fraud, which is our current attorney general now, unfortunately. We have seen one of the lawsuits that I brought back in February that's still ongoing was for thousands of FBI personnel who worked on the January 6 cases, investigating and helping prosecute them. And of course, the Trump administration has threatened to publicly reveal who they are because what they did is said to have been wrong, because it doesn't fit the narrative of what Donald Trump and his allies wanted for January 6th. The former acting U.S. attorney, Ed Martin, who's now a pardon lawyer, top Justice Department official, he was actually present at January 6th at the Capitol. Didn't enter it, so he didn't get prosecuted, but he was on the grounds. There's footage of it, and he defended a number of the people who were prosecuted. In fact, he was serving as the acting U.S. attorney while he was still representing January 6 criminal defendants, and he dismissed the cases against his own clients, which has brought a subject of an ethical complaint against him that's now pending within the DC bar. We've never seen anything like this. Career prosecutors have been quitting. I've talked to a lot of folks who are still in there, and they share information with me as to how unhappy they are. A lot of folks have retired prematurely. It is really sad and depressing to see what is going on in an agency that I greatly respect and really was fond of, the Department of Justice. I mean, this was Bobby Kennedy, right, was the Attorney General in charge of the Department of Justice, and now, of course, we've got his son over at HHS, quite a different environment. But it is a serious problem. I mean, we could spend a whole presentation just going down a litany of things that they've done. Now we've got Jeanine Pirro, we got all these Fox News personalities. I've been on Fox News many times. It's been a while, but I used to go on many times. But I didn't expect the pundits to become part of the administration.
And you haven't gotten a call.
I have not.
Yeah.
I have been banned by Fox since the last administration. But I used to go on Hannity and Hannity's show. I used to go on Laura Ingram's show, Bill O'Reilly's show, Tucker Carlson's show, Megyn Kelly's show. Because I would be an expert witness or an expert commentator on some national security issue. It wasn't a political thing. I go on MSNBC, CNN, doesn't matter to me. But yeah, it's a different world now.
Yeah. Just a question from the audience, just about political violence, which we talked about earlier on, and we've sort of been sort of running through a lot of the answers. Is there, what can we do to take the temperature down as individuals or as groups to sort of reduce the temperature of political violence, not only just against politicians, but also the temperature in terms of discussing with people in our own communities?
We need to start talking to one another again. I, like everyone else, have had negative encounters with people online or in person. And what I've always found, especially when it's online and you don't know the person, you might misread a tone or you misinterpret something. I have found it has always made the world of difference to then invite that person to have an actual conversation. Hey, let's get together. Let's go get lunch. Let's go have a beer, whatever it might be. And those individuals, almost every time I have done that, have become friends rather than continuing to be adversaries, if not enemies. There was a point in time. I remember when I first moved to DC in the early 90s, and I would talk to people who'd been here for decades before. The notion of this relationships of members of Congress, before they started to become millionaires in order to become elected, they weren't paid very much. This was their job. They would share apartments, Republicans and Democrats. They would eat together. They would play racquetball, squash together. They would do all these things together. And so there would be a friendship between them. They might have philosophical, fundamental differences on policy, but it would be like the sheep and the wolf in the Looney Tune cartoons, right? You fight during the day, and then when you punched out, you were friends, asking each other how your wives were and things like that, and how are the kids doing. That doesn't exist now, because if you praise or even say something complimentary about someone on the other side, you get attacked by your own side. That needs to stop. There needs to be greater discourse. People need to interact. The reality is, most of us, and there's a saying that was attributed to Ronald Reagan that goes something like, someone who agrees with you 80% of the time is an ally, not a 20% enemy. And most people, we probably agree on the vast majority of things. And that 20% of the differences is something that we can totally tolerate. Now, it'd be different. Hey, they're anti-Semitic, they're a murderer, they're a pedophile, right? If you're within that 20% and it's some extreme thing, no, that 20% will make the difference. That's not an ally. But I'm talking about the majority of the common person, where, you just disagree about, you can come up with even something as crucial or controversial as abortion, but you can still be friends because you agree about everything else.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many people that I know have said, well, I've defriended people on Facebook because I just don't agree, with them anymore. And it's kind of sad because, I think back to this weekend, and someone I'm pretty friendly with posted something to the effect of, oh, those crazies are out there, protesting, no kings. And, it's tough to hear that. But I think you have some wise counsel to sort of say, hey, it's better to sit down and talk with them about it and sort of get a sense of why they feel the way they do, as opposed to, just trying to ignore them. One of the questions is kind of interesting, and it goes to the definition of a constitutional crisis, because I know there are a lot of different views of what a constitutional crisis is. And this person basically is saying, the fact that people, as the Trump administration deported, alleged certain undocumented aliens to El Salvador. The fact that they were taken away without due process, isn't that a sign of a constitutional crisis? Or another example, the fact that Congress is not effectively challenging the president, isn't that a sign of a constitutional crisis that's already in our midst?
Yeah, I wouldn't go so far as saying constitutional crisis. To me, that is something, so severe. Is it a constitutional problem, concern? Sure. The executive branch doing something bad, something wrong, something illegal. Frankly, it happens in every administration, regardless of political party that's in power. It's what they do in the aftermath that really will make the difference. It could have been a mistake. I mean, they admitted they deported Abrego Garcia by mistake. It was the aftermath that was really the problem, of the refusal to bring him back, which obviously they ended up doing regardless. But being ordered by a court to do it, being ordered and having the court rule that what was done and how it was done was illegal. And it was the rule of law, it was the due process part of it. I do think the Democrats, including my Senator Van Hollen, who I've known since he was a member of the House of Representatives, I think they made an error of embracing the individual as the Maryland man. It wasn't about him. he may end up being a bad guy, and he should have been deported. He was supposed to be deported, just not to El Salvador. I don't know the guy, right? I only know what's in the news about it, but it wasn't about him. It was the due process that made all the difference in the world that they weren't following. And that's what we want to follow. You know, the saddest part, and I think probably why a lot of people are supporting Trump, particularly amongst the independents, why he got reelected, is the policies he's pushing, a lot of people can agree with. I don't want illegals in the country, especially who are committing crimes. Who wants that? But I want them properly removed. I want them to go through the due process. I want them to go through the asylum process to see if it makes sense. You know, so many of the policies that have been implemented. Do I want to cut waste and fraud from the U.S. government? Yeah, I represent whistleblowers all the time who are decrying waste and fraud. But you don't destroy the U.S. Agency for International Development in the process. You don't force out all of our diplomats who have hundreds of years of diplomatic experience, because you can't replace that with, you know, 24, 25-year-old grad students. They don't have the experience. I mean, it's the implementation and the violation of norms, the disregard or the deregard, I don't know if it's which word, disregarding norms and policies that have worked. Now, some of it, maybe we needed to have a sledgehammer to, but not in the way it was. Like, you know, we can go into all the stuff Doge and all that. But we see right now the system is somewhat working, because that's what's keeping, you know, the balance. As it goes a little bit too far to one side, there are powers that are bringing it back.
Are you concerned that the administration can further expand sending suspects off to El Salvador without due process, that maybe go beyond undocumented aliens?
Oh, without a doubt.
Like you and me?
I'm concerned that they could do it to American citizens, which there have been some instances of that. I went to Canada recently to give a speech, and I purposely left my cell phone at home because I was concerned of whether I would have an issue at the border, because there have been some lawyers, they've been immigration lawyers, so they've been targeted because of that. I didn't have any issues coming back into the country, but you know, that was a concern. This administration, I'll tell you what they are doing. They are pushing as close to the line and going over it to see what the reaction will be from Congress, which is basically nothing, from the population, the populace, which hasn't been that significant, not in large quantities, the judiciary, which is the only place that's pushing them back at the moment. So to me, my concern is, at what point in time do they disregard the judiciary? That's the constitutional crisis. But how far do they go in trying to see what the power is that they could capture? Because when they get pushed back by the judiciary, they didn't lose any ground. They just went back to status quo. But if they gain a little bit of power, if they can kind of stretch the fabric a little bit, it gives them more room. It always reminds me of the famous poem post World War II by the pastor Niemöller. I'm probably saying it wrong, but everybody's going to know what it is, right? You know, they came for the communists, but I didn't speak out because I'm not a communist. They came for the socialists. I didn't speak out. I'm not a socialist. They came for the Jews. I didn't speak out. I'm not Jewish. I am. So I would have spoken out. But they came for me, and there was nobody left to speak out. And that's the problem. And I know, you know, you and I went when we were trying to figure out we'd have time to speak about the attacks on law firms. So I want to get this one point out. Why are the lawyers being attacked? Why have I lost my security clearance as someone who is not political, but represented people that the Trump administration doesn't like? The lawyers, law, and the courts, we are the front line in this battle. And there's a reason why in Shakespeare, Henry VI, that Dick the Butcher, I always call Trump the Butcher, the character Dick the Butcher says, let's kill all the lawyers. And everybody grows up thinking that that's a slam, an insult to lawyers. Anyone who had a lawyer in their family or a law student, and they come home from Thanksgiving, your friends and family are making fun of you. Oh, we're going to kill you all. Shakespeare says it, right? Because that's just how we think this is. The reality is the reason why Dick the Butcher wants to kill all the lawyers is because the person he's working for as a thug is authoritarian. And they know in order to capture power and get rid of those who would be in the way, the lawyers have to be removed. The lawyers will uphold rule of law and stop authoritarianism. And if you take the lawyers away, then it's a straight path towards ultimate power.
Yeah, I wanted you to talk a bit, since it does hit close to home, about what you're going through in terms of your revocation. But certain law firms are also pledging pro bono contributions to fund work for Trump on certain conservative issues, and they're doing that to protect their ability to do business with the government and preserve their security clearances. And I was just kind of curious what you thought about that aspect
I mean, I
of
thought
it.
it was a really poor decision by any of the firms to capitulate to Trump, and they've gone from what 40 million to I think $100 million of pledged pro bono experience. I'm all for pro bono work. I do most of my representation in this administration pro bono, and I'm constantly doing that. And the causes, fighting anti-Semitism, stopping this or that. I mean, hey, the causes, I'm all for it, but that's because I choose to do it, not because I'm forced to do it. And I mean, who wants a lawyer who's going to capitulate and not fight? And some of the firms, there's no guarantee that they won't even be targeted yet again. Now, I'm not going to make a judgment call on any lawyer in these firms as to like why you haven't stood up and said something against your firm, or why you haven't quit, because I don't know if I could stand in their shoes. I don't know what their financial situations are. I don't know what their family situations are. I only know that I chose to fight when I was attacked by this administration. In fact, there's oral arguments in my case on June 27th, and there'll be a public line. If anybody wants to listen in, I can give you the phone number. You can call the court and listen in to the oral arguments. To me, I wasn't even thinking twice that I wouldn't be fighting back against something that I thought was done inappropriately, whether it was to me or to anyone else. And a number of my clients, of course, have been targeted by these executive orders as well. I think it was a sad state of affairs for the rule of law and lawyers to see these firms capitulate, which is why actually the American Bar Association just this week filed another lawsuit against the Trump administration because of the attack on lawyers and law firms.
I wanted to go back to the courts for a second, because you talked about them as lawyers in the courts as the final guardrail. And one of the questions we have from the audience is, what do you think about the Supreme Court versus federal and district judges? It seems they support Trump more, and I guess what they're referring to is that the Supreme Court seems to be leaning more towards Trump. And are there cases coming up that could prove to be the tipping point? Or, just kind of wondering what your thoughts are on the Supreme Court versus the rest of the judiciary.
Look, elections matter. So right now, there are more conservative justices on the court than so-called liberal justices, or at least Republican appointed versus Democrat appointed. We saw Merrick Garland should have been on the Supreme Court, is not, because elections mattered. I don't know how. I think anyone who predicts how the Supreme Court or any judge is going to rule is deluding themselves, because that's a dangerous thing to do. It's interesting, realistically, practically speaking, if you look at the rulings of the Supreme Court, for those who follow it, most Supreme Court rulings are not close by way of how many, right? There's actually not that many 5-4 or 6-3 decisions. Very often, the court is very unified. It's the very high profile, politically charged cases that we mostly hear about, where we see these 5-4, 6-3 decisions. I I would not rule out some of these conservative justices ruling against the Trump administration, particularly just Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Comey Barrett, even Gorsuch, and I'm trying to think who else. I mean, you can pretty much obviously factor in like where they fit on sort of the ideological scale. But I think one of the cases that's coming up, or one of the issues that's coming up that concerns me the most, one, because I'm litigating it at the lower court levels, is the power of the presidency under Article 2 of the Constitution to just fire anyone he wants without due process. So, meaning we have all these statutes and regulations in place that governs the termination and discipline of federal employees to enable due process. You're being proposed to be fired. You have an opportunity to respond in writing. You have an opportunity to appear in a personal appearance, have a lawyer, make arguments, things like that, have an appeal. There have been many senior government officials that Trump has just fired outright under this alleged constitutional power without any due process. That case has not yet reached the Supreme Court. It will. It will absolutely within the next year or so. And how that court rules, much in the way of the immunity decision that came at the end or middle of last year, whenever it was, those are the cases that will really impact where things go going forward. And that's the case actually that I'm really interested to see how the executive branch will respond if the Supreme Court says, no, you can't do it, due process is required.
I'm particularly concerned about that as a former banker and employee of the Federal Reserve.
I have
It
sued
really
the Federal Reserve.
good for you. But it's just concerning because if for some reason he does have the power to remove the chairman of the Fed, that could be disastrous for our economy. And he sort of uses language to belittle him and to criticize him, which is not good form.
Well, we saw, right, the head of the Smithsonian, he fired, and the Smithsonian isn't even under the authority of the executive branch, given how it was created. But she decided to, instead of fighting, she decided to step away for the betterment of the institution, thinking the institution would suffer too greatly if she put up a fight.
Yeah. We have a question about, military, and I just want to we're getting towards the end, so I just want to sort of go through that. I'm trying to merge a question I had for you with one that we had from the group. I'm sorry.
Probably like the use of the military, if we look at the California situation.
Yeah, or just, actually the strength of the military, considering the Secretary of Defense, and are we still considered to be a major military power, considering, who the Secretary of Defense is, what's happened in terms of the banning of transgender folks, and the reduction in ability of women to serve. I guess I'm a little scared when I think of Trump sitting in the Situation Room, with Tulsi Gabbard and Kristi Noem and Pete Hegseth, and I'm sort of curious what you think our standing is in terms of the military at this point.
Right. Well, and news reports in the last 72 hours have been that Hegseth is not being consulted, much to the chagrin of his staff, that Tulsi Gabbard wasn't invited into the planning meetings for what's going on with Iran. That's probably sounds good, but it also sounds really bad.
It's scary.
I'm sorry. These are the people you're supposed to be relying on. These are supposed to be the experts. Look, we're still obviously a military power, if not the strongest, certainly, first, second strongest in the world, depending on how you want to look at it. Even if certainly if you push the nuclear weapons aside, we are still one of the strongest military in the world, depending on what the nature of the fighting is. But it is of concern where the folks inside the military are being attacked. It is of concern, like you said, with the transgender. I'm on the cusp of getting involved in the battle because the officers who are being involuntarily dismissed from the military are having a code put into their record that they were removed because they're national security threats to the United States. You know, I'm sorry. I thought we got beyond the nature of not homosexuality being considered, you know, a threat or affront in that standpoint. The last 40, 50 years, I thought we had made great progress. So we may be bringing a lawsuit. We're literally working on it now to challenge that aspect of it. Not necessarily that they're being involuntarily discharged. Those lawsuits already exist. But at least with the national security kind of characteristic of it. You know, the parade we just had with the 250th anniversary of the Army, you know, good for the Army, happy birthday, but for Trump's birthday as well. And, you know, it was not it did not look like Nazi Germany or the Soviets or North Korea. You know, our people apparently don't march very well. Some say it's because their hearts weren't in it. And, you know, they weren't looking at the president as they went by the stand. You know, maybe, I don't know. More concerned about the speech that Trump gave. I guess it was at West Point. There was one at West Point.
Yeah.
At Fort Bragg, where it was really apparent that they made sure there were only military members who supported Trump cheering him on. And I have no problem if a military member supports Trump. That's their right to do. But cheering him on, bringing politics into the military, more so of the cheering on the derision, the divisiveness statements, the negative statements about adversaries that they then cheered. That's a problem. I work with military all the time. Every single day I represent military, enlisted and officers, and this really has them concerned.
Yeah. Last question. There are so many cases, as you mentioned, 170, 180 cases. And, you know, you hear stuff about it in the news, but is there a credible tracker that folks like, you know, you or that we could use also to keep up on everything? What's the best way to do that?
Yeah, there are a few that are great trackers. One is the New York Times one is doing it. The one I often use is at justsecurity.org, and I shall put it into the chat room for people right there. That is an excellent one and is usually updated within a few days of something being filed. Let me see if there what other one. Trump Trials Clearinghouse. Just Security, and then I said the New York Times. It's also one, I think this group American Opposition was doing it as well. I don't know how active this one still is, but I'll just put it up there just in case. But the Just Security one is particularly good.
Great. Well, I think we're almost at 8 o'clock, and I'll turn it over to Ava. But before I do, Mark, thank you so much. Really enjoyed the chat. It was very enlightening.
Thank you.
And we, you know, really appreciate the time and effort and especially taking time away from your busy schedule.
No, I appreciate the time and the opportunity. It's to get people to start thinking and understanding what's going on, to pay attention, right, to see if we can affect a change.
Thanks. And I hope it doesn't get as grim as
I
you
hope
said,
not.
but yeah. Ava, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Marshall. Hi, everybody. I'm Ava. I'm the Deputy Director of Indivisible. We just want to thank you all so much for spending this gorgeous evening here in Charlotte with us. And Mark, we're so appreciative for your time and insights. We appreciate your knowledge and experience related to national security, rule of law, due process, and freedom of speech. This information, as you mentioned, helps inform us as we do the work to create a democracy that represents all, engaging every voice in the shared process of governance to build a future that promotes justice and equity. We have a few other events that are coming up we wanted to share, and just want to say thanks to, we saw some familiar faces that were here with us last night as we conducted our verifier training with the Carolina Migrant Network. As always, we here at ICLT believe that immigrants are welcome here. We have 2 new member orientations via Zoom. One is on June 26th, is a Thursday, another June 29th, which is a Sunday. We'll pop those links into the comments. We also have a ton of pop-up protests. Krista and Dave and the team are keeping us going with nearly a dozen every week. And then our next social will be July 2nd. It'll be in person, and it's the Starlight on 22nd in NODA. So you can register for that. Thanks again, Mark and Marshall, for helping to facilitate this, and all of you, and we'll hope to see you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Be safe.
Thanks. Bye.